You want me to admit?
Yeah, here I got it. Okay, so just admitted everybody. So I'll just give it like 10 seconds and then I'll stop sharing.
Okay.
All right, all you.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start in just a moment. Welcome. Okay, good evening. Can you all hear me well? Great. My name is Joel Whitney. It pleases me to welcome you to the August edition of Climate Reads. This is co-presented by Writers Rebel New York City and Orion Magazine. And we're returning with Trace by Laurette Savoy. We were with authors Catherine Alto, Marissa Landrigan, Mira Subramanian, who will discuss the book with Carrie Schulenberg, and then we'll turn to you. Sand and stone are Earth's fragmented memory. Each of us, too, is a landscape inscribed by memory and loss. One life-defining lesson Laurette Savoy learned as a young girl was this: the American land did not hate. As an educator and Earth historian, she has tracked the continent's past from the relics of deep time, but the paths of ancestors towards her, paths of free and enslaved Africans, colonists from Europe, and peoples indigenous to this land lie largely eroded and lost. In this provocative and powerful mosaic of personal journeys and historical inquiry across a continent and time, Savoy explores how the country's still unfolding history and ideas of race have marked her and the land. This is a fascinating book. It's winding up a year of talks about climate change through books, both fictional and non-fictional, every other month. And tonight's moderator, Carrie Schulenberg, is part of the Writers Rebel New York City group that launched the series and chose these books. So thanks so much to you, Carrie. This is part of BPL's ongoing author talk series and book discussions. And I just want to let you know about a few other upcoming events, including University Open Air, which takes place in Prospect Park in the open air, of course, on September 9th. And all of the professors are immigrants to the United States who are accredited in their home countries, but not here. That's the unique part of this series that we're doing, once again, starting on September 9th. And Lit Film is coming up at the end of the month. That's a festival of films that the library curates, where all the films are about writers, documentaries, and fictional films alike. My colleague will drop those links into the chat now, as well as BPL Present social handles. And then I just want to tell you how this works if you're here for the first time. We really mean it when we say we want to hear from you, and I'll prove that by getting out of the way in just a moment. Our authors and environmentalists will get us started, our voices and panelists, and then we want to have your thoughts. So just write it in the chat, and if you want us to read it, write question or comment in all caps in front of it, and we'll try to address it. Otherwise, we'll assume that you're just talking to each other, which we also welcome. And I should have mentioned that in addition to Zooming this together in this electronic bubble, we're also streaming it to the BPL Presents Facebook page, BPL Presents being the arts and culture department here at Brooklyn Public Library. And I also want to add that Brooklyn Public Library is on the unceded homeland of Lenape people, what our colleagues at the Lenape Center, and what in their language is called Lenape Hokie. As libraries try to provide accurate information in a world of erasures, we start by acknowledging this history and doing our best to help raise up Indigenous voices in all that we do, including some programs we're excited to announce soon. And we don't take any of it lightly, as we acknowledge that awful legacy that removed so many First Peoples from their lands. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to thank Orion Magazine, and they're co-presenting this with us, and Nick Triolo is going to welcome you on behalf of Orion.
Hey everyone, I'll keep this really quick. I'm the web editor and content strategist for Orion, and we're just so honored to be sponsoring this event again and just being a part of it. If for those of you that don't know Orion, we are a quarterly print magazine, 100% ad-free, exploring the intersection of ecology, justice, and place. And we've been around for just around 40 years. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. And this book, this wonderful read, is very much exploring topics and textures that the magazine really centers itself around. So it's very congruent, and we're happy to be here. I'm going to drop I'm going to link into the chat after I get off of here with a 20% off for everyone's subscription for those attendees. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please join us. And then the last thing I'll say is that we have a bunch of fun events coming up as well. We have an event with Robert McFarlane and Robin Wall Kimmer that's coming up in September. We have an event with Allison Hawthorne Deming about her new book, and we're partnering with Grist as well. And so we're gonna have an event in September as well. So lots of fun stuff. Check that out on our website. I'll drop it in the chat as well. And thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Nick. So this is a really exciting panel. We have Catherine Alto, who is an American historian, designer, teacher, speaker, and New York Times bestselling author living in England. For the past 25 years, her creative practice has fused nature and culture, teaching the literature of nature and place, designing artful and sustainable gardens, and writing about the natural world. She travels widely as a keynote speaker throughout North America and Britain. Catherine is the author of 3 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Natural World of Winnie the Pooh, A Walk Through the Forest That Inspired the 100-Acre Wood, and Nature and Human Intervention. Her 3rd book is Writing Wild, Women Poets, Ramblers, and Mavericks, Women Who Shape How We See the Natural World. This book explores the lives, landscapes, and literature of 25 classic, new, and overlooked female nature writers. Her essays have appeared in Smithsonian Magazine, Outside, Sierra, BuzzFeed, Resurgence, and The Ecologist, and more. Her work has been widely reviewed, including NPR's All Things Considered, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and People as a Best New Book Pick. Marissa Landrigan is the author of The Vegetarian's Guide to Eating Meat, a memoir chronicling her journey from vegetarian to ethical omnivore. Her creative nonfiction has appeared in numerous journals, including The Atlantic, Orion, Creative Nonfiction, Guernica, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA in Creative Writing and Environment from Iowa State University and is currently an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, where she teaches creative, digital, and professional writing. Meera Subramanian is an award-winning journalist who has explored the disappearance of India's vultures, questioned the good Anthropocene, and investigated perceptions of climate change among conservative Americans. She is a contributing editor of Orion and former MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow and Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Visiting Professor in the Environment and Humanities at Princeton University. Her narrative nonfiction book, A River Runs Again, India's Natural World in Crisis, was a 2016 Orion Book Award finalist. And we'll put their websites in the chat. Carrie Schoolenberg describes herself as a green librarian, having created over 24 public programs aimed at climate change and sustainable living, including selecting the books for the inaugural Climate Reads series this year that we've just gotten through. She is a Writers Rebel NYC member and outdoors enthusiast. Most recently, she hiked over 1,000 miles of the Appalachian Trail and was a guest on the radio program Writers Project of Ghana, discussing how libraries, access to literature and media revolutionizes communities. Please welcome Carrie as we turn it over to you and our panelists. Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Meera and Catherine and Marissa, for chatting with me. Just listening to your introductions, I already know who you are, but I'm just excited to chat with you. So thank you for meeting here with us. So I'm excited to talk about Trace, our last book in the Climate Read series, which you may or may not have finished, and either way is fine. But Trace, for me, it was really exciting to read because I think it's one of those history books that has answered all these questions that we've all been like dying to hear. At least that's how I felt. And for me, I always felt like I was constantly asking myself, why didn't I already know this? Why wasn't I taught this on a regular basis throughout school? So reading it over and over again, I kept having these moments of like, this is great. I'm so glad I'm hearing this. And she does such a beautiful job of intertwining culture and environmental history that leaves, for me, And I think readers, without a doubt, knowing that the two are codependent on each other. And that is a very rare quality that I've seen in American history books. So what does that say? What does Trace tell us about our history? What does it say about our future on this planet? And what does it say about our choices being made today? We're going to be talking about a lot of these things with these three women. And we're going to start off with a pretty easy question, you might think, but I think some readers will be reading this and think, why is this in a climate read series? What does Trace have to do with climate change? And what does it have to do with the environment? And Mira, I'm going to start with you. How would you answer that?
Yeah, it has everything to do with it in like the wonderfully subtle way. I think that we are framing conversations around climate justice has become a major tenor of talking about climate and climate action. But oftentimes it's sort of used as almost a blunt instrument. And Laurette's book gets into the much deeper roots, like literally deep time, deep geology, and the layers and layers and layers of accretion of the world that we're inhabiting right now, and how that's been influenced by all those layers that came up. And also, as those layers, I mean, she talks about, we'll get into this more, but just the heart of the story of really talking about the stories that are missing from our narratives, period, and why they're missing. I kept thinking as I read this book about agnotology, which is the study of ignorance, really like this fundamental idea about why do we know what we know, and why do we know, more importantly, what we don't know, and why do we not know it? So there's this, her ideas of her just digging and digging and digging physically into the landscape and into our histories. And what she comes up with is about how we treat the land has such a parallel to how we treat each other, and the commodification that we have of humans that we've had for so long, and of the land and of resources. And all that comes together with the climate crisis. It's all of one piece. So that's why this book fits, even though there's not talk about marginalized communities, there is not talk of greenhouse gases, except for a fleeting mention. It's not direct, but it just infuses the entire narrative.
Yeah, I would agree. Climate change is a full conversation. You can't really isolate any of the factors without talking about all the factors. Catherine, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, thank you, Mira. I enjoyed hearing your response to that. So when I wrote Writing Wild, I had to imagine, I imagined crafting, kind of becoming like a jeweler in a way, because I had to create this gem that was as enlightening to as many women as possible. So I ended up selecting 25 multifaceted women, and then I focused on 50 others. But of course, I had to include Carolyn Merchant, who wrote The Death of Nature. And at that point, so I read it when I was an undergrad, and I actually took a class with her at Berkeley. And then I read it, of course, when I wrote this book. And for me, that was one of these fundamental books. It had to be included. I wouldn't say she's a nature writer. She's one of the leading environmental historians. And I thought, that was as far back as I was going to go. I was going to understand how the scientific revolution impacted us today. But when I read Trace by Laurette Savoy, it's sort of the narrative lodged in me even deeper because of her earth sciences background, and intertwining geologic metaphors and geological understandings. So with Trace and your question about the Anthropocene, I have begun to think much farther back than the scientific revolution in the early like 15th century or so, but really thinking, as she has said, we humanoids have been walking around the planet for about 200,000 years, and the question is, undoubtedly we've changed, especially since woman I profiled, Dorothy Wordsworth, this romantic writer and sister of William Wordsworth, who lived on one end of this industrial revolution, really. But Laura asks us to think, how do we live responsibly in the Anthropocene? And we also have, she says, the capacity to ask significant questions about our lives. And, as she has said, lives that are not our own. And we do that through stories and reading narratives that we carry, that others carry, and understanding, as we'll talk about later, phantom narratives and phantom stories, which is our responsibility to try to see in the landscape.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up phantom narratives, because for me, that was a new term. And I want to say that she coined that term, but I haven't looked into the history of the word. So I'm going to go ahead and say she coined it. But that was something I really loved about Trace, is her ability to, this is the history of what happened, but I loved the moments when she would look at the censuses and then say, like, well, this is who lived here. At least this is who we know lived here. But I know through these, like, it's like she was a detective and had to figure out and ask questions. And she even asked herself, like, am I being annoying for asking what happened to the slaves on this plantation? Am I being annoying for asking where they lived? Which should be basic questions. And she goes on to say, because of the hands that worked these fields, America had faced financial, got a lot of money. And so where is the proof for the people who made that happen? And I loved her term phantom histories, and how we see that even in the places where history is supposed to be smacking us in the face, we're still asking ourselves, okay, but what about all these other histories that nobody wants to talk about for some reason? And that goes into, and Marissa, I'm gonna switch over to you now, since we haven't given you a chance to talk just yet, but let's talk about when she is talking about the American toponyms, about how the naming of the places and how that shows who lives there and who didn't live there. She has a quote that says, Savoy says that she used the N-word once featured in at least 200 American toponyms from Maine to Alaska. She goes on to say that despite official changes to use Negro instead, the pejorative term continues in pockets of local speech and some maps. Discuss this revelation and others from the chapter and how it relates to the questions, who belongs here? Do I belong here? Do you belong here? This is my land, or this is your land. And Marissa, do you have any comment on how we interact with the space around us?
Sure, yeah. I think this connects to something that Mira was saying about the way that this sort of the history of historically excluded and marginalized communities is sort of present in this text, and the way that there's also sort of an echo of the climate crisis in that, right? And climate justice and environmental justice. These names reveal, right, the way that we name things reveals something pretty significant, I think, about what we do or don't value, right, as a culture and as a society. The way that we use language, right, communicates what we value, what we pay attention to. And so in that chapter, in What's in a Name, one of the things that I think Savoy is doing really well is kind of weaving together these names of places that are reflective of, historic devaluing, right? Names that use these sort of offensive terminologies, names that use slurs, is one of those traces, one of the ways in which we've layered meaning and value and culture onto the environment, like quite literally, right, by writing names on maps. One of the other things that she talks about in that chapter that I thought was really interesting is also the erasure of names and of language. The way that so many indigenous place names, for instance, have been completely erased from history, places that have been, given new names, given Anglo names instead in place of the indigenous names that once existed for them. And now, of course, the movement towards, renaming or reverting to those original indigenous place names. So that both, the lingering sort of offensive names and the absent names, right, the traces of the indigenous names that once were, is sort of one of the ways in which our culture has left its mark on environment as a signal for the things that we do and don't value.
Yeah, Marissa, your book you're a food writer, so you know food is a lot about culture. Language goes into culture, and Savoy's book combines, how does culture impact the environment and vice versa? How does the environment impact culture? As the food writer, somebody focuses on food. Did any other ideas come into your mind while you're reading it, or did anything stick out to you from Trace?
Absolutely. One of the things that I wrote about, one of the things I was really interested in writing about when I wrote the book was the intersection of food and place, or food and landscape. And one of the things that I'm sort of exploring is the different ways in which landscape and environment, so both natural landscape and sort of built and man-made environments, impact food access, right? That we think and talk about like ethical foods, or sort of ethical or sustainable agriculture, ethical diets. We often take this sort of one size fits all approach to it, this idea that there is one right way to grow food, or one most ethical form of eating or diet, that doesn't take into account the nuances of landscape and environment. Everything from like literally what you can grow in the soil in a given place is different, right? From, climate region to climate region, but also in terms of food access, things like food deserts, or neighborhoods that don't have certain types of grocery stores or restaurants present in them, neighborhoods that are just low income, that even if you had the best Whole Foods in the country right next door, you couldn't afford to shop or to buy sort of certain products. I think that both landscape and environment, impact what we have access to in terms of sort of dominant culture and cultural values, in a way that's very particular by region, and with some of these other sort of factors that I just talked about. And so I think that one of the things that Savoy is looking at in this book is the way in which those layers of landscape and culture and environment shift over time and from place to place.
Yeah, Mira, do you have anything to add to that? Oh, wait, we can't hear. I can't hear Mira.
Sorry, I was making sure that you couldn't hear me drinking water. Yeah, I mean, in terms of that chapter about names, I thought that was also really fascinating of what gets put on the land, and also the lost in translation that happens in that process. Like, I lived out in Oregon, and it was fascinating how she talked about how that was just the information just didn't get, it was like typo after typo. So it's both misinterpretation by people coming in and just taking some and imposing something else. And that happens, I'm in Cape Cod, which is Wampanoag land, and this is an area that it's a mashup of Europe. We've got Barnstable, we have Sandwich, we have Plymouth, and then we have the native lands on the name, Pocasset and Mashpee, and all the. So it's just this mix of bringing things in and putting them onto the land, and also keeping names that reside, but then erasing the history of where those names came from. And so I thought it was really interesting when she talked about, I don't know how to pronounce the Nadi, the native name for the Apache. She talks about wisdom sits in places, this idea that it really is of the place. And when we think about how we connect to our landscapes, I think that's really important. I think we don't recognize that in the same way that we could, in terms of the wisdom that is in places and what that reveals about the place.
Can I pop in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I did not know that Walt Whitman had begun writing something about names. I mean, anything Walt Whitman writes, I'm into that. So can I just read quickly on the heels of what Mira just said, what Walt Whitman said? Is that all right? That what Laurette Savoy says. She says that Walt Whitman too praised indigenous names that rolled with venison richness upon the palate, end quote. He'd set out in the 1850s to celebrate the language of the United States in an American primer, quote, All the greatness of any land at any time lies folded in its names, Whitman wrote. Words follow character, nativity, independence, individuality. End quote. Elements he believed set the United States and Americas apart. Being of the national blood, indigenous words that gave a taste of identity and locality contributed to this unique American character. So I really enjoyed rereading that chapter and being reminded of that, so long ago that he was doing it to acknowledge the richness of the sound and to give them ownership of the place, and instead of being displaced like they are, but placing indigenous peoples where they're from. So I really appreciated that. I could say more, but I'll just leave it there.
No, I agree with you. I think reading Savoy, it changes the way you drive down the highway and you see the names of places, and it changed the way I thought about things. And again, that also led to me wondering, like, why is this the first time that I'm thinking about the way that this land used to be called, that it's been named, and what does it say about the fact that we all know this place is Boston, Massachusetts, which is where I am right now, instead of, that's the land of the Pawtucket. And what does that say about, the effects of white settlerism and how it's still, even though it feels normal to us, how it's still for the native people who live here, it's like, well, that's actually not what it's called. Did you guys have that reaction at all? Have you noticed a visceral reaction, I suppose?
For me, since I don't live in the United States anymore. Of course, I did until I was about 39. So I go back and forth a fair amount. And every time I go back, it's becoming a stranger and stranger place to me. And the place names, it's funny because I will have my phone with me, leading me around with an English accent, trying to pronounce Native American names of places where it is Native, named that way. And it's always a hoot for me. When I wrote Writing Wild, I was so glad to find that a mountain was named after a woman, Mount Mary Austin in Southern California. It's one of the very few geographical features named after women, because most of them in the United States are named after male soldiers, presidents, geologists, scientists, and so forth. So even to have a female there was like great progress. But yet, I'm from, I was born in, Ohlone territory, then moved to Miwok territory in Northern California, and then lived for 15 years on Snohomish lands, homeland. And so especially up in the Puget Sound area, there's much more, Snohomish, Puyallup, and Skykomish, Tulalip tribes are much more prominent up there. And then when you leave and then come back, you can see where it's prominent and where it is not, and I would suppose you all would know better than I would at this point.
Hey, Carrie, can I give a shout out to, she mentions it in passing, but this Home Ground, which is edited by Barry Lopez and Deborah Gwartney, it looks like she was a researcher on it, and this is just such an amazing book in terms of place names, and it's just all these small entries that just take you to other places and you experience them in a totally different way, and then bringing back a lot of words that have been lost about how we talk about the landscape. It's almost like you go to the grocery store and there's one tomato or one potato instead of there. We know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of ways to talk about the diversity of landscapes, but I think we've lost a lot of that as we've lost touch with our land.
Yeah,
I know.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Marissa.
That's okay. I know Joel and Nicholas were mentioning earlier that Orion has an event coming up with Robert McFarlane, who has written a whole book about this, who's the name of the book I can't remember now, where he's sort of devoted to like collecting the language and the vocabulary of landscape that are either, that have sort of been lost, right, to the sands of time, or that are very specific and particular to certain locations. One of the other Walt Whitman quotes that Savoy has in here that I really loved is names are the turning point of who shall be master. That naming is really an act of is sort of a biblical idea that naming is this act of like mastery or power or dominance. But I think it also connects to what Mira was saying earlier about the idea that language is also a way of knowing place, right? A language is a sort of a bowl, right, that holds place-based knowledge for us, and especially I think in Indigenous cultures, and the sort of cultivating and preserving the language of those places is also a way of sort of preserving culture and ancestral knowledge.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how much of the imposing of Europeanism, how much of it was intentional, how much of it was accidental. And then my next question is, well, does it matter? I mean, that's what happened and that's what we did. And either way, it's led to so much loss of, as Mira mentioned, connection just through language and through food, as you mentioned, Marissa. And it's, you know, you can just go down this spiral and you see, I mean, what we've been talking about, how like history and language and environment, like you can't talk about one without the other. Any other thoughts on that before we move on to any other topics, or? No, we're good right now. So one of the questions, if you go onto Laurette Savoy's website, she has a list of things that she wants readers to take out of it. So I'm going to read one of her questions now, but comes from Laurette Savoy herself. She says that Trace invites readers to cultivate broader, deeper perspectives that acknowledge enduring injustices of our society and realizes the context of racism on the American land in a deliberate way. So we've sort of already been going there, but we've discussed mainly the Native people of the U.S., but she doesn't stop there. I mean, you could go on in the U.S., but especially particularly towards the end of the book, she leans towards somewhat more recent history in terms of how her own mother faced racism throughout the Army and in different camps throughout, how the borders in the Mexican Arizona area, how that has changed the locations, how that's changed the cities, how that's changed the people who lived there, whether there was a mass migration to or from. I really loved the part where she's talking about the river that runs through it. It's not the San Jose River. Do you guys remember which part I'm talking about?
Pedro, I think.
The San Pedro, yes, the San Pedro River. And she spends a lot of time talking about how that was it is a historical place of migration for animals and humans. And now there's this physical walls at some points that is limiting that. And she poses the question, does anyone think that the beaver is an illegal immigrant? And I loved that point. And she said it so smoothly and then moves on to other impacts that humans have had, that, you know, white colonialism has had on the people that dwell there. Do you have any thoughts on the political borders and how politics impacts it through the way that Savoy has talked about it, or just in your own observations? Let's start with you, Mira.
I mean, yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been doing writing and researching into my own family background from my folks who are here with us tonight. My mom's great grandfather came from Germany to Texas and was one of the first cartographers of that area who was doing some of that mapping. He could have been on some of the surveys that Savoy writes about in the mid 1800s, when Texas was a new place, technically, a new part of the United States, and all of those boundaries were being drawn, and the way that was such a part of manifest destiny just playing out, that there was such a deep assumption that there was nothing questionable about the acts that were happening then, and the power of the pen and the paper and the compass and the survey tools, that you can take something and just by the act of putting it on paper, you transform the reality of lived people's lives, regardless of what the validity of that is, and then the disproportionate weight that goes there. And I just loved how she peeled back. I mean, that chapter where she's leading up to her mother's story, that is so cryptic. She has a mother who just does not want to talk about the past at all. And so she, as a researcher and historian and geologist, goes back and it's just peeling layer after layer after layer. And in the beginning, I'm like, where is she going? Like, where is she going with this? Because I couldn't quite tell where, we know we're heading towards the mother, but we're all over the place in the process of doing that. But then when we finally get to Fort Huachuca, I think it was, where she was serving in the army as a nurse, you realize how all those layers just led right to that moment. And so that's what I just loved about this book the most, was just the way that she built the layers up as a way to bring us to today and show that there's just so much going on around us that we are ignorant of, that we just don't know. And so much of that is visiting places and trying to find something that happened there, and there's no evidence of it. There's no evidence on paper. As I've been doing research on Texas, there's this gigantic stack of books by white men, and to try to find a narrative from any other perspective is incredibly difficult. And that's just one place, but it exemplifies what happens everywhere. The victors write the stories, but those aren't the stories. Those aren't the only stories.
Right.
I think that idea that those aren't the only stories is really key, and kind of like maybe one of the fundamental ideas of this book, right? One of the passages that Savoy writes that I think is maybe my favorite is the idea that history cannot be single voiced, right? That it can never be single voiced in order to be complete, that any story that we tell about a place or about an element of our culture is incomplete, is one piece of the sort of fragmented mosaic that actually makes up the history of a place. And so, one of our jobs, one of our responsibilities when we look at place and history and culture is to ask, like, what aren't we hearing, right? What are those sort of forgotten stories? And what are the traces of those things that remain in a place that tip us off to the fact that there's a story here that we haven't paid attention to? This is something that I think about in Pittsburgh a lot. And I think this probably will resonate with other people who live in similar sort of like northeastern cities, Boston, New York, even Chicago, that I think that there's this sort of mythology of northern cities, that they were sort of like a sanctuary from anti-Black racism, that, with the Great Migration and Black Americans leaving the South and moving to these northern cities, that's because like racism lived there in the South and they were escaping up here. And of course, we know that is vast oversimplification, and that there's lots and lots of strains of racism in these northern cities. And Pittsburgh in particular has been sort of engaged in a reckoning with this over the last couple of years. Recently, the city's Commission on Race and Gender Equality released a report that looked at sort of various measures of health and safety for Black Pittsburghers against Pittsburghers of other races, and specifically compared Black Pittsburghers' outcomes against Black outcomes in other northeastern cities, and found that almost across the board, outcomes were for mortality and health and safety were significantly lower for Black Pittsburghers than Black citizens in almost any other northeastern city, just by virtue of being in this place. Black women have like much higher rates of maternal mortality, much higher rates of poverty, much lower rates of employment. Black men have much higher rates of cancer and cardiovascular disease, much higher rates of homicide here. The report went so far as to say that simply by moving to another city, a Black Pittsburgher's life expectancy would go up. And that was just one of these places where here is this massive trace, right, this evidence that there is a more complex and layered racial history on this place than we have yet reckoned with and acknowledged, right? We have to try to figure out what is this telling us about the place, about the way that we have built this city and constructed this environment that's so damaging to certain communities? And how do we work to reconstruct the landscape and the environment to be more equitable now that we can see this fragment that we weren't paying attention to before?
Yes, actually on our website, we post reading guides, and one of the points on the reading guide, we do suggested reads, but or suggestions. And you can find, which you guys may already be familiar with, there's a redlining map. Now it's escaping me who exactly did it, but there you can find in whatever city you live in historical redlining maps and how that impacted the city. And Marissa, you're doing a great job of also saying what Savoy has been able to intertwine is how racism directly impacts the environment, how it directly impacts food access, how it directly impacts what food is grown there, if food is grown there, if you're allowed to have food there. I mean, she didn't even say all the examples that she could have said. And Marissa, you're bringing up some really good present day ones. Catherine, do you have any other?
Can I just throw out, like, the climate, those maps are totally overlap. Now there's researchers who are overlaying climate impacts in terms of heat island effect, other flooding, all of these things. If you overlay these maps from communities that have been pushed to the edges, often literally and figuratively, and they are they're getting the disproportionate effects of climate change as well. So that's just yet another layer that we're seeing build upon that.
Yeah,
sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
We're seeing that with Hurricane Ida right now too, aren't we? With all the climate impacts. Catherine, sorry, we keep cutting you off.
No, not at all. I really am enjoying this as much as everybody else. Well, as I was reading this, I was thinking about where I grew up, which is in what we call the breadbasket of the world. We rename the Central Valley in that way. It's big ag. California is the 6th biggest economy in the world, and it has to do with that agriculture. So I grew up in corporate big ag, and halfway between San Francisco and Yosemite. Which is, the Miwok area. But I grew up, surrounded by in a small town, a small town in big farming country that, the folks who picked the grapes and harvested the nuts and ran the corn harvesting machines, they were Mexican immigrants, and they were all, often derogatorily called wetbacks. And I grew up with that. And this idea that these that sort of that racism, blatant racism there was really common. Wetback is the name, people swimming across the Rio Grande. That is the reference. And I just began to think deeply through reading Trace about, the people who've passed through and narrative. So I searched for, in Writing Wild, to give voice to a Mexican-American writer. And I could not find one. And I have, for decades, I've wanted to know, I've wanted to read migrant stories of people working in that area. But my history, the history I was taught was history in California begins with the gold rush in 1850. So you have these, colonizers coming in because of mining, which is the story across, treaties, why these treaties were broken, why the people were, trying to establish treaties. And so the sense of, manifest destiny, that doctrine that we had the right to completely expand as far westward as possible. And I did not like it, but I liked that Laura Savoy put it in. Senator John Calhoun from South Carolina said, "Ours is the government of the white man." Just hearing people talk like that back then, it gives you a sense of that residue, those histories, those phantom stories that are missing. And I was trying to tie that a little bit in with what Marissa was talking about with food, because I come from this area where the economy in California is reliant on immigrants doing this work, and yet I don't know their stories in the landscape. That is something I'm actually trying to create a proposal for a work on that, so I can help and give voice to as many people as I can that call the Central Valley home or have called it home. So there's a lot going on there, I suppose.
Yeah, we're getting close to our time being up, but I just want to encourage our audience to please ask questions. I'm going to be turning to you guys pretty soon here. I'm just going to ask another question here while giving everyone time to ruminate, but I want to make sure that we use Trace and Savoy's words and think about what it means for the future and what it means for the choices that we're making right now. You know, going back to Phantom Histories, we can see just through reading her book that we've lost so much by not knowing these things. And I'm curious what you guys think about, well, I mean, you guys are writers, you guys are the ones that are changing this right now, and I appreciate that. What do you see? What do you see happening? What do you see yourselves doing? How do you see the narrative changing? Can we have an impact after reading Trace's book?
Who do you want to start with?
I know, should I choose someone, or I was giving you time to think for a moment? Let's start with Marissa.
Sure. Yeah, I think that one of the things that Catherine was saying is a really significant part, right? Which is we have a responsibility to go looking for the voices that haven't been amplified, right? That haven't been just like placed in front of us. When we're researching a story, or when we want to tell the story of a place, or even to write about a particular experience, to sort of interrogate some of our own gaps in understanding. I was talking to a friend the other day about this exact idea about gaps in understanding, and I used the phrase blind spots to describe my own gaps in understanding, and my friend very kindly pointed out that that's ableist language, right? So even while talking about these sort of potential holes in my own knowledge, I was alerted to another gap in my own understanding, right? In the way that I sort of think about things. I've also been thinking about this a lot lately because at the beginning of a school year, I'm a professor as well. And so one of the things that I take pretty seriously as my responsibility there is making sure to have a diverse and inclusive reading list on all of my syllabi in all of the courses that I teach, not just relying on the essays or the texts that might have just sort of come across my radar that I might just be aware of because I know that I have, you know, a particular community, a particular like network that skews white and female and educated. And so to make sure that I'm, you know, going looking for those things and diversifying my own reading so that, you know, what's on my radar is bigger to begin with in the first place, to the point now where if I can avoid having like, you know, sort of traditionally overrepresented voices on my syllabus, I will very happy to sort of go in the opposite direction and just include as many Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer writers and disabled writers as I can, to make sure that both I and my students are getting that sort of fragmented, multi-voiced experience of whatever it is we're reading about.
Yeah. Mira, looks like you were ready to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to do that work as well. And as a journalist, it's amazing how easy it is to just keep being led down the same path. And it's so important to do the work and do the homework to really find other voices, because they're out there. There are people doing all sorts of amazing work all over the place. I was actually thinking, when you asked about like the writing and how it fits into larger storytelling, I was really struck by in the chapter Alien Land Epic, where she's drawing on Aldo Leopold's seminal book and also her father's novel, and trying to bring together these two ideas about being alien and trying to have a land epic. I was really struck by that chapter, and she talks about when she's like digging into her father's books that she gets some comfort by finding, you know, that these struggles have been going on generation after generation. You know, she says, no question, no fear, no anger or shame was unique to me or my time. But she also talks about the bottomless fear freight at realizing the persistence of human ugliness. And that was, I think that keeps recurring for me. I mean, just as we deal with the news, as we deal with the climate news on top of political news, of how do you tell stories that both help link us to that this is an ongoing battle, that there's no moment of winning it. I think that there is a struggle around climate action, that there's not going to be like, oh, good, we won. Like there, and I think that is universal with civil rights, with all of these issues. That's important for new generations that are coming into these struggles to be aware of. But I also kind of I wanted to throw it out to Catherine and Marissa of like, is climate, like, is there a fundamental difference about this issue beyond these perennial human struggles? I mean, I don't have an answer, but it's a question that I've been grappling with since I read this.
Marissa, would you like to give that one a shot?
Sure. I mean, I don't know if I have a sort of a clear answer to that. I think if there is a difference, it is sort of scale, perhaps, right? Yeah. One of the things that's happened over the course of human history is the world has become more interconnected and more global, is that the scale of our impact on the environment and on each other, of course, has increased, but so too has sort of deepened our awareness of that impact. And so I think if it's different, it is that we have a greater awareness and therefore a greater responsibility, right, to sort of manage that awareness. I've been thinking a lot about climate, and another recent book that I read, Elizabeth Rush's Rise, Dispatches from the New American Shore, which is about rising sea levels. And one of the things that she does really well is look at both sort of like the global impact of rising sea levels, how that's a result of the climate crisis, but then sort of zooms into a handful of particular locations where the sea level is rising and looks at how that impacts that place specifically. So she looks, for instance, at Long Island in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. She looks at like Gulf Coast, Louisiana. She looks at the Bay Area and a handful of other places. So there's this sort of dual movement between the global and the local. And so I think if there's a difference in the climate crisis, it is that we know that we have a global impact that also has this sort of like particular local impact, and it's not enough. It's no longer enough to try to fight it or manage it on a local level. In looking at the Bay Area in this book, Elizabeth Rush talks about sort of Silicon Valley's, desire to fix everything with technology, their belief that they can just like build a bigger wall or develop some technology to sort of stave off the rising sea level. But that she's sort of acknowledging that no matter what technology Silicon Valley manages to come up with, the ocean levels will continue to rise, right? That's not something they can individually impact. That's something so we somehow need to manage a global response at the local level.
Yeah, Marissa, I like what you're saying there. I have a couple of points. The first is, well, what you're saying about, as narrative nonfiction writers, we can have narrative presence in a way that is quite engaging to readers, which Trace has. If it were only a geological metaphor kind of book, it wouldn't be as engaging. And so we like to know about her history. We like her presence on the page. And of course, Elizabeth Rush does that too. She's quite, it's this, brings in a cacophony of voices, but her lyrical presence and lyrical, even when she talks about science, is very important for us. So as a writer, this is one, I've spent a month in California, and, my first time ever in July, and I came back about a month ago, actually. And for the first time in my life, I thought, are the airports going to be shut because of wildfires? And incidentally, when I got Rising by Elizabeth Rush to include her, she's the last person I include in Writing Wild. That was that was the week my brother's house burned down in the car fire in Northern California. So, climate change in California is real. And so what I'm trying to do is interject a an authentic personal narrative in that. And so I have to interface with primary sources all the time, from, one thing I could do is walk the path that John Muir walked. That was initially my thing. And I think no, that's like such a white woman tracing a white man's path, and I thought, no, I have to go farther back. And, you know what you know what you don't know what you don't know. So you have to, as a writer, I'm constantly trying to put myself in that last category to surprise myself, to surprise the reader. And it's not hard. It's not easy. Sorry, that's the time zone taking effect there. But it's not easy to do. And so that's my responsibility. I am focusing in on California right now to talk about climate change, and Savoy's work, Trace, inspires me to look at naming, to look at the hidden narratives, the phantom stories, to give Hispanics and Mexicans in the area voice. Talk to these people who are picking the grapes and harvesting tomatoes in 110 degree Fahrenheit, and more. And it's to do it in an authentic way. So that is my challenge, both as someone, as a personal essayist, really responding to climate change, and interjected with this kind of deep time thinking that you really only get with someone like an earth scientist, that goes farther back and thinks earth processes and traces geologically, but we need to do is what Marissa says, but think of traces closer to ourselves too. So that's what I have to say.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Savoy's book is so fantastic, because she somehow is able to navigate like the personal narratives, and also she does talk about this like geology of some places. It's impressive, the areas that she goes to. I'm going to read a question here from one of our participants. This comes from April Alvarez, and her question is, I haven't read the book yet, but I love how much all of you are so clearly excited about it. Savoy seems to pull together what on the surface might be disparate pieces. Can you talk about how these braids and threads come together? Catherine, I haven't started with you in a minute, so I'm going to start with you.
How the braids come together. Well, I mean, one of my favorite lines comes at the end. She says, the past, it's about what I like, and my partner is a geologist, so I hear of fragmentation and deposition and erosion and all this kind of thing, these processes. But I like what she says at the end, which I was going to talk about anyway, but it relates to this question. She says, the past I've emerged from is also broken and pitted by gaps left by silences stretched across generations, by losses of language and voice, by human displacements, by immeasurable dimensions of lives compressed and deflated, and by dismembering narratives of who we are to each other in this land, illusions of rootedness, rootlessness in one's own home could only grow in such depleted and contested soil. So it's letting her take you to a point where you're reading the landscape in a new way. And that, it's not all colonial, colonial narratives. That is just, those are the easy stories. But putting those aside, and we didn't talk about the reasons why those stories persist, but she does. I forget in what chapter she does that. Sort of collective, convenient forgetting. And that is a braid that kind of runs through everything. It's let yourself learn geological terminology, erosion, deposition, fragmentation, and apply those to the human psyche, and how our government still, those narratives still persist, and allow yourself to be convinced that people who are trying to rename things, it's important. It's really important, and to acknowledge on whose land you used to be, that you're living on now, their homeland, and to be able to tell those stories too. So all of that is woven in. I think that the science and the storytelling are woven in ways that often you don't often get in some nature writers who like Annie Dillard, who is, you travel 1,000,000 miles metaphysically in one space. Tinker Creek, for example, you can travel greatly that way. But here Savoy is bringing in her geologic perspective, and that runs throughout the book.
Mira, how would you say that the braids come together? How does Savoy braid all these things that we've been talking about together?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually kind of like a wonderfully simple structure in terms of the braids. I mean, she starts with a move that her family makes from California, which is like, that's her home. She's a California girl, and yet they're going back to her father's, where he grew up in DC, and where his family goes back generations. So she is just a little girl. She's 7 years old. You know, there's the first opening scenes is her standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon as they're taking this trip across country, and she's collecting stones, and she's collecting postcards along the way, and taking snapshots. And so she kind of sets the scene of the family, of the two parents, of different places of dislocation of home and not home, and then digging down and realizing that even the place that's not your home is your home, because your family goes back so long and deeply. And so she sets the stage in that first opening part of the book, and then each of those threads she goes deeper into with each of the chapters. You know, she goes deeper into DC, she goes deeper into her mother's history along the borders in the Southwest, and I love the end. I mean, it's not like a spoiler alert, but just that she gets back into her professional work as a geologist, and just the crazy happenstance and luck of discovering something like a fossil, like what it takes to unearth something like that. That fossil has been there. It's been there for a very, very, very long time, but it's just a whole bunch of random things that brought her with her hammer to this one place at this one moment in time to discover it. And so I just loved the metaphorical levels of what was happening with her writing, that all these stories had been around. Her mother might not talk about them, and the history, when she goes to try to find it, is erased except for tiny little mentions on a census list. But these were lives, and they were full, long lives that had complexities. And so, like, just like that fish stuck in the rock, it was, there's all these stories all around us, and we're just have to go looking for them.
Yeah, thank you.
Marissa, what do you?
Yeah, Marissa, looks like you're gonna get the last.
Well, both of you were talking about how there are these sort of great like metaphors for the structure of the book, sort of built into the structure of the book. I think that they exist both in sort of the natural world, fragmentation and deposition, as Catherine was saying, and also in that sort of sense of archaeology and uncovering. I think of the structure of this book, or books even like this, as a kind of like a mosaic almost, or a collage. I like mosaics because they're like broken, sharp-edged pieces better, where she is sort of taking this thing, history, which we want to think of as sort of solid and fixed and true, and taking her hammer to it, right, smashing it into these little bits and pieces, and then saying, when we put this back together, our goal is not to reconstruct, but to make new, right, to make something new out of all these shards. So she's putting the shards that we are familiar with back in, right, like racism and colonialism and violence, but is also intentionally leaving these spaces between those shards, right, and saying, you know, what's here in this negative space that we haven't paid attention to, or, you know, what other pieces, right, from other, you know, broken things can I sort of collage into building this new mosaic. And so one of the ways I think it works, one of the ways in which those threads come together, is not a refusal, but a resistance to the idea that they have to fit together perfectly, right? An idea that, you can learn, or that the sort of new thing can emerge that includes these cracks and spaces and pieces that don't fit together and sort of sharp, jagged edges, right? Those can be a part of the new structure we're building. And so I think that works literally in the narrative, where she occasionally would just allow sort of disparate subjects to exist alongside each other, with questions, sort of unanswered or unanswerable questions, sort of threading them together and allowing that space to be part of the narrative that she's building.
That I love that metaphor, and I think that's a beautiful place to end our conversation. I think that's a great way to put it, that she's broken apart history and then is looking into the negative space. I think that's really beautiful. Thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Mira, and thank you, Catherine. And now I'm going to bring it back to Joel and wrap things up here.
Well, I just want to echo that thanks to all of our panelists, Marissa, Catherine, Mira, and you, Carrie, for leading this conversation. And again, for choosing all of these books that we've been discussing for a year in the series Climate Reads, which, congrats, it was wonderful. And to the folks at Orion Magazine, thanks for being with us and for co-presenting this with us and bringing new audience members to come and join these conversations. And of course, to the writers at Writers Rebel, thanks so much for your presence, for your brainstorms, for your thoughts, your wisdom, your kindness, and your insights. And to the audience, thank you for being here. You have the most important in this calculation. We can't do this without you. And please follow all of these wonderful organizations and writers, and sign up for everyone's social medias, Catherine's, Marissa's, Mira's, Carrie's, and see what's coming up as the library. And I think Orion and Writers Rebel go into different versions of our fall normals, and hopefully find some cooler weather and hopefully some rest from the raging hurricanes and the raging wildfires that remind us that we have to do more, especially since they won't be resting. They'll be coming back with a vengeance. So please stay engaged. And I thank you all again, to the panelists, to the audience, and to the organizations involved. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah.